He was a man forged in silence, his past a locked room with no key. The people of Redemption Gulch knew him only as Stone, the half-breed tracker who communicated with a glance, a gesture, or the heavy weight of gold dust in a leather pouch. When he strode into the saloon to buy a bride, they expected a transaction of savage simplicity. What they didn't know was that he wasn't buying a woman. He was buying a chance, and the woman he received with eyes full of frightened fire and a spirit bound in chains of debt would do more than share his home. She would rebuild his soul. This is the story of how a silent man paid for a bride, but received a woman who taught him the forgotten language of grace and the terrifying courage to hope. The air in Redemption Gulch was a gritty cocktail of alkali dust, cheap whiskey, and despair. It clung to the back of the throat and settled in the soul like a fine layer of soot. For Rosalind Vance, it was the taste of her gilded cage. She stood behind the makeshift counter of her father's failing mercantile, arranging tins of peaches into a pyramid that would inevitably be toppled by a drunken cowhand. Her father, a man whose intellect was matched only by his weakness for the turn of a card, was currently engaged in the final desperate act of his own ruin across the street in the Gilded Cage saloon. The saloon's bat-wing doors were the jaws of the beast that was slowly consuming their lives. The beast's name was Bartholomew Thorne. Thorne owned the saloon, the hotel the livery, and most of the men in town one way or another. He was a man of expansive appetites and zero compassion, his smile a predatory flash of gold teeth that matched the nugget he wore as a tie pin. He had been circling Rosalind for months, his compliments as oily and unwelcome as the slick on a stagnant pond. Rosalind had come west from Boston, with her father dreaming of botanical sketches and the vast, open freedom of the plains. She had found only confinement. Her education, her finely practiced manners, and her love for poetry were useless currencies here. In Redemption Gulch, the only currency that mattered was power, and Bartholomew Thorne held the entire bank. The saloon doors swung open, and her father, Professor Alistair Vance, stumbled out. His face, usually a mask of academic preoccupation, was ashen. He didn't look at her. His gaze fixed on the boardwalk beneath his feet, as if he might fall through it into the depths of the earth. Behind him, emanating an aura of triumphant ownership, was Thorne. "A moment, Professor!" Thorne's voice boomed, stopping Alistair in his tracks. "We have a final piece of business." Thorne's eyes, small and dark like a boar's, flickered to the mercantile, pinning Rosalind where she stood. A cold dread, familiar and sharp, coiled in her stomach. "Rosalind, my dear," Thorne called, his voice thick with false courtesy. "Your father and I have come to an arrangement, a most permanent one." A small crowd began to gather, the blacksmith wiping his hands on a leather apron, a few prospectors, their faces etched with sun and cynicism. They were vultures, sensing a kill. Alistair Vance finally looked at his daughter, and the shame in his eyes was a physical blow. "Rosalind," he whispered, his voice cracking. I had no choice. The professor's debt is settled," Thorne announced, stepping forward and placing a heavy possessive hand on Alistair's shoulder. "In exchange for a partnership, a marital partnership, between myself and your lovely daughter." The world tilted. The tins of peaches, the dusty street, the leering faces, they all blurred into a nauseating swirl. She was a chattel, a poker chip cashed in to cover a fool's losses. Her breath caught in her throat, a choked sob of protest she couldn't voice. "I believe the lady has a say in this," a voice said. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the murmuring crowd like a well-honed blade. The voice was so unexpected that everyone, including Thorne, turned. The source was a man who seemed to have materialized from the heat haze itself. He stood near the water trough, tall and broad-shouldered his features, a study in sharp angles and sun-darkened skin. His hair was black and fell straight to his shoulders, and his eyes were the color of dark, wet slate. He wore scuffed leather trousers and a simple cotton shirt, but there was an unnerving stillness about him, a coiled intensity that made the armed men on the street seem like loud, clumsy boys. It was Stone. He was an enigma in Redemption Gulch. He lived in a cabin somewhere deep in the canyons, appearing every few months to trade prime pelts and raw gold for supplies. He never spoke. Not a word. He would point, nod, or simply lay the correct payment on the counter. His silence was absolute, leading to wild speculation. Some said his tongue had been cut out. Others that he was a renegade, hiding from a terrible past. The most common belief was that he was half Apache, a man caught between two worlds and welcome in neither. Thorne narrowed his eyes. "This doesn't concern you, Breed. This is business between gentlemen." Stone's gaze didn't waver from Thorne. He took a slow step forward, his movements fluid and deliberate. The crowd parted for him, as if he were a phantom. He stopped before the Vances, and Thorne, his presence a silent challenge that was more intimidating than any spoken threat. He looked at Rosalind, and for a fleeting moment his expression was unreadable. It wasn't pity, and it wasn't lust. It was an assessment keen and penetrating, as if he were seeing not just the terrified woman, but the steel spine holding her upright. Then his gaze shifted to Alistair Vance. With a motion as smooth as a riverstone, he unslung a heavy leather pouch from his belt. He didn't offer it to Thorne. He held it out to the trembling professor. The drawstring was loosened, and with a flick of his wrist, Stone poured a shimmering cascade of gold dust and small rough nuggets onto the dusty boardwalk. It wasn't a fortune, but it was more than enough. The sunlight caught the flakes, creating a dazzling pile of wealth at Alistair Vance's feet. It was a king's ransom in this town. More than enough to cover any debt Thorne could possibly have manufactured. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Stone then did something that stunned everyone into complete silence. He looked directly at Rosalind, his slate-grey eyes holding hers. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a command, it was a question, an offer. Rosalind's mind raced. On one side was Thorne, a life of gilded servitude, of pouring hands, and a suffocated spirit. On the other was this man, this silent, dangerous unknown. He was offering her an escape, but to where, to what, he had not bought her from Thorne. He had erased the debt that bound her. He had, in essence, bought her freedom. What he wanted in return was the terrifying, unspoken question. She looked at her father's pathetic, crumbling face. She looked at Thorne's expression, which had curdled from triumph to incandescent rage. And then she looked back at the silent man. In his eyes, she saw not the savagery the town whispered of, but a profound and desolate loneliness. It was a landscape she recognized. Taking a deep breath that tasted of dust and newfound determination, Rosalind Vance made her choice. She lifted her chin, pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, and took a deliberate step away from her father and toward the silent man who had just paid the price for her life. Bartholomew Thorne's face went purple with rage. "What is the meaning of this? You can't just—" Stone turned his head slowly, and the look in his eyes was enough to halt Thorne's tirade mid-sentence. It was a flat, cold look devoid of emotion, but filled with a chilling promise of swift, decisive violence. Thorne, for all his bluster, was a man who understood power dynamics. He recognized that the silent tracker was operating on a level of primal certainty he couldn't match with hired guns and blustering threats alone. "The debt is paid." Stone's voice rasped the first time most in the crowd had ever heard it. It was low and gravelly, like stones grinding together the sound of an instrument long unused. The two words hung in the air, a definitive statement that allowed for no negotiation. He didn't wait for a reply. He gave a slight jerk of his head toward the livery and instruction for Rosalind. She hesitated for only a second, then walked her back straight toward the stables. She could feel the stares of the entire town on her burning into her dress. She was no longer Professor Vance's daughter. She was now the property of the silent half-breed. Or so they thought. She herself wasn't entirely sure what she was. Inside the livery, the smell of hay and horse was a relief from the tension of the street. Stone moved with quiet efficiency, saddling a sturdy-looking mare and his own powerful buckskin. He didn't speak to her, didn't even look at her. He simply worked his hands, sure and practiced. He tied a bedroll and a small sack of what she assumed were her belongings, hastily gathered by her father, and given to him in a final, shame-faced exchange behind the mare's saddle. When he was done, he approached her, holding out the reins. She flinched instinctively, a small, involuntary movement. His hand froze in mid-air. He looked down at his own hand, then back at her face, and a flicker of something, was it, understanding, regret, crossed his features. He laid the reins gently over the saddle horn instead, taking a step back to give her space. The gesture was small, but it was significant. Thorn would have grabbed her wrist. He would have pushed her toward the horse. This man, this savage, had shown her more courtesy in that single moment than Thorn had in months of false pleasantries. The ride out of Redemption Gulch was a silent ordeal. The townsfolk watched them go their whispers, following them like buzzing flies. Rosalind kept her gaze fixed straight ahead between her horse's ears, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her fear or her tears. Stone rode slightly ahead of her, a silent guardian, his back a rigid wall against the town they were leaving behind. They rode for hours, climbing out of the dusty basin and into the rocky, pinon-dotted hills. The silence between them was immense, a living entity. It wasn't a comfortable silence. It was heavy with unspoken questions, with her fear and his mystery. She tried to think of what to say, but the words wouldn't form. What does one say to the man who has just purchased your life with a bag of gold? Thank you. Where are we going? What do you want from me? Each question seemed both momentous and utterly inadequate. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple, he finally reined in his horse. They were on a high mesa, overlooking a vast expanse of canyons and sculpted rock formations. He dismounted and without a word began to make a small, smokeless fire with an efficiency that was mesmerizing to watch. He offered her a canteen of water and a piece of jerky. She took them, her stomach churning, but she forced herself to drink and eat. Weakness would be a liability out here. As dusk settled, casting long, eerie shadows across the land, the enormity of her situation crashed down on her. She had exchanged a known prison for an unknown wilderness, a vocal monster for a silent one. Tears pricked at her eyes, hot and unwelcome. She turned away, not wanting him to see her cry. She felt a presence beside her. He had moved with absolute silence. He stood a few feet away, not looking at her, but at the fire. He held out a blanket. It was a simple wool trade blanket, clean and thick. She took it, her fingers brushing his. His skin was calloused and warm. The brief contact sent a strange jolt through her. "Cole," he said. The single word was rough, a stone pulled from the bottom of a dry well. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders. "Thank you," she managed to whisper. He gave a slight nod, his attention returning to the fire. And that was all. He rolled himself in his own bedroll on the other side of the small fire, his back to her, and seemed to fall asleep instantly, though she knew he was as alert as a wolf. Rosalind sat awake for hours, clutching the blanket, listening to the night sounds of the desert. The chirp of crickets, the distant howl of a coyote, the soft sigh of the wind through the sagebrush. She was terrified, yet for the first time, in a long time, she was not being watched by predatory eyes. The man on the other side of the fire had demanded nothing of her. He had offered her water, food, and warmth, and then he had given her distance. She didn't understand him. She didn't know if he was her savior or simply a different kind of captor. But as she finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, she knew one thing for certain. The weight of his gold had been heavy, but the weight of his silence was heavier still. It was a silence she would have to learn to navigate or be crushed by it. The next day's journey was longer, taking them deeper into a labyrinth of red rock and juniper. The landscape was beautiful and brutal, a place that cared nothing for human frailty. Stone navigated it with an innate, almost reverent understanding, his horse picking its way through trails that were invisible to Rosalind's untrained eye. He remained silent, but she began to notice other forms of communication. A hand signal to indicate loose rock ahead. A subtle shift in his posture that told her to be still as a deer watched them from a ridge. He spoke a language of movement, of observation, and she found herself beginning slowly to understand it. Late in the afternoon, they descended into a small hidden valley. A clear stream ran through it, lined with cottonwoods, whose leaves shimmered green and gold in the sunlight. Tucked against the base of a sheer canyon wall was a cabin. It was not the crude, primitive hovel she might have expected. It was a small, sturdy structure of hand-hewn logs, chinked tightly with clay. A thin curl of smoke rose from a stone chimney, suggesting he had banked a fire before leaving. There was a small, well-tended garden plot nearby, with rows of beans and squash and a corral holding a spare horse. This was a home, a place of order and intention. Stone dismounted and led the horses to the stream to drink. He left her to take in the sight again, giving her space, allowing her to approach this new chapter of her life on her own terms. Tentatively, Rosalind slid from the saddle, her legs stiff. She walked to the cabin door, which was made of heavy planed wood. It was unlocked. She pushed it open and stepped inside. The interior was a single large room, and it stopped her breath. It was meticulously clean and organized. A simple bed was built into one corner, its blankets folded with military precision. A stone hearth dominated one wall with cooking implements hanging from hooks, scrubbed clean and gleaming. But it was the other side of the room that truly shocked her. Books. A rough-hewn shelf ran the length of the wall, and it was filled with books. She saw the familiar spines of Shakespeare's tragedies, a collection of poems by Keats, a well-worn copy of Moby Dick, and several thick volumes on botany and geology. These were not the possessions of an unthinking savage. This was the library of a thinking, feeling man. Stone entered behind her, his footsteps silent on the wooden floor. He placed a sack of flour on the table and began to unpack the other supplies he'd bought in town. "You read?" Rosalind stated the words, coming out as a soft gasp of surprise. He glanced at the bookshelf, then at her. He nodded. "All of them." Another nod. This new information warred with everything she thought she knew about him. The silent, intimidating tracker, the half-breed outcast, spent his solitary evenings with Keats and Melville. The paradox was dizzying. For the next few days, a strange domestic routine settled over them. It was a life lived in near total silence, yet it was not empty. It was filled with the language of shared tasks. He would rise before dawn hunt or tend his traps and return with game. She, drawing on a domesticity she hadn't realized she possessed, would prepare the food. She learned the rhythms of his home, how he liked his coffee, the way he mended his own gear with small, neat stitches, the hour he would sit by the window as the sun set his face, impassive, but his eyes seeing things far beyond the canyon walls. She began to see the grace in his movements, the economy in every action. There was no wasted energy, no thoughtless gesture. He moved through the world with a profound and quiet competence that she started to find not intimidating, but reassuring. One evening, a week after her arrival, she found the courage to push the boundaries of their silence. He was cleaning his rifle by the firelight, his long fingers working with practiced skill. Rosalind took a book from the shelf. It was the Keats. She opened it to a poem she loved, Ode to a Nightingale. Her voice, when she began to read, was soft and hesitant in the quiet cabin. My heart aches, and a drowsy numbness pains my sense as though of hemlock I had drunk. He stopped his work. He didn't look at her, but his hand stilled on the rifle, his head cocked slightly. He was listening. She continued, her voice growing stronger, more confident, as the beauty of the words filled the space between them. She read the entire poem, her voice weaving a tapestry of sound in the silent room. When she finished, the silence that returned was different. It was softer, less heavy. She looked at him. He was still staring into the fire, but his expression had changed. The hard lines around his mouth had softened. In the flickering light, she could see a profound sadness in his eyes, a deep well of pain that his silence had guarded. He cleared his throat. "Again," he rasped. It was a request, a plea. She smiled, a genuine, unforced smile for the first time in what felt like an eternity. She opened the book and began to read again. In the small cabin, hidden from the harsh judgment of the world, a woman who had lost her freedom began teaching a man who had lost his voice the power of words. She was not his prisoner, and he was not her captor. They were two solitary souls beginning to find a new kind of language in the quiet heart of the wilderness. The poetry readings became their nightly ritual. Rosalind would choose a passage, Shakespeare, Whitman, sometimes even from her father's geology textbooks, describing the slow, powerful forces that shaped the very canyons around them. Stone would listen his silence, no longer a barrier, but a vessel absorbing the words, the rhythms, the emotions she poured into the air. He began to change. The change was subtle, like the shifting of light at dawn. A tension she hadn't even been fully aware of began to leave his shoulders. He started to meet her gaze more often, his slate-grey eyes holding hers for a moment longer than necessary. The breakthrough came during a sudden, violent thunderstorm. The sky, which had been a placid blue, turned a bruised purple in a matter of minutes. Wind howled through the canyon, and rain lashed against the cabin in furious sheets. A deafening crack of thunder shook the very foundations of the log walls, and a bolt of lightning struck a tall pine on the ridge above them, setting it ablaze in a terrifying, instantaneous torch. Rosalind, who had been stoking the fire, jumped back with a startled cry, dropping the poker with a clatter. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She had always been afraid of storms of their chaotic, untamable power. Stone was on his feet in an instant. He moved not to the window to look at the fire, but to her. He stood before her, his large frame a shield against the fury outside. He saw her trembling, her face pale in the firelight. He reached out not to touch her, but he held his hand palm up in the space between them. It was an offering of comfort, a silent question. "Are you all right?" She nodded, though she was anything but. Another clap of thunder, louder this time, rattled the tin cups on the shelf. She flinched violently, a small choked sob escaping her lips. This time he did touch her. He placed his hand gently on her shoulder. His touch was firm, grounding. It wasn't possessive, it was protective. "It is only noise," he said, his voice low and rough, but clear. 3 words, the most he had ever spoken to her at one time. "I know," she whispered, "but it's the lack of control, the violence of it." He looked at her, and his expression was one of deep, painful understanding. He slowly withdrew his hand and walked to the small window, looking out at the blazing pine, its fiery branches flailing against the black, rain-swept sky. "I was a boy," he began, his voice halting, as if he were pulling the words up from a great and painful depth. "Not much older than 10. My mother was Apache, my father a white trapper. They lived away from others like this. We were peaceful." Rosalind held her breath, knowing this was a sacred moment, the turning of a key in a long, locked door. Men came. Prospectors. They wanted the land because my father found color in the stream. He told them no. They came back. He paused, his jaw working. They did not like that my father had an Apache wife. They called me things. He turned from the window to face her, and the pain in his eyes was so raw it was almost unbearable to witness. I was hiding in the root cellar. My mother hid me there. She told me to be silent. No matter what I heard, I had to be silent, or they would find me too. His voice broke on the last words. So I listened. I listened to them destroy my home. I listened to them hurt my mother and father, and I was silent. I was silent as they died. Tears were streaming down Rosalind's face, silent tears of empathy for the boy who had been forced to bear the unbearable. When I came out, everything was gone, burned. They were gone. The silence, it saved my life, and it became my prison. I stayed silent for years. Words felt like a betrayal, a noise I didn't deserve to make when they were silent forever. The dam had broken. The story poured out of him, fragmented and raw. How he was found by a passing patrol from a nearby fort, how he was taken in, but never accepted, a silent wild boy they called Stone, because he was as hard and uncommunicative as the rock he was found sleeping on. He learned to read devouring books as a substitute for human connection. He learned the ways of both the white man and the Apache, mastering the skills of the wilderness until he could disappear into it completely. He had built this life, this solitary, silent fortress, to protect himself from a world that had taken everything from him. When he finished, the cabin was quiet again, save for the drumming of the rain and the crackle of the fire. The storm outside seemed to have diminished, its fury spent. Rosalind walked over to him. She didn't know what to say. There were no words for a pain that vast, so she did the only thing she could. She reached up and gently placed her hand on his cheek. He flinched at the contact, then leaned into her touch, a shudder running through his powerful frame. He closed his eyes, and a single tear traced a path through the dust on his skin. "Your silence didn't betray them," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It honored their last wish. It kept you alive. And your voice does not betray them either. It proves they did not die for nothing. It proves you survived." He opened his eyes and looked at her. The desolate loneliness was still there, but it was no longer absolute. In the depths of his gaze, a tiny, fragile flicker of something new had been lit. It was the courage to hope. He had shared the source of his silence with her, and she had not run. She had offered him grace. And in that moment, in the heart of the storm, the man known as Stone began ever so slowly to learn his own name again. His father had called him Daniel. Life in the canyon took on a new quality. The silence was still there, but it was a comfortable shared quiet, now punctuated by conversation. Daniel, as she now called him in the privacy of their cabin, began to speak more. His voice, still rough, grew stronger with use. He told her about the plants in her garden, the habits of the animals he tracked, stories his mother had told him about the stars. In return, she told him about Boston, about the sea, about the bustling world so different from his own. They were building a bridge of words and understanding across the chasm of their different experiences. He taught her how to track, how to read the subtle signs of the wilderness. She, in turn, helped him with his reading, unraveling the more complex sentences of the geology texts, her finger tracing the words as he sounded them out. A tender, unspoken affection grew between them, as quiet and steady as the stream that ran through their valley. It was a fragile peace, and Rosalind cherished it. But the shadow of Bartholomew Thorne was long, and it stretched even this far. Thorne had not been idle. Publicly humiliated and privately seething, his obsession with possessing Rosalind had curdled into a venomous need for revenge against them both. He saw Stone's act not as the settling of a debt, but as a personal theft. He had put the word out that he wanted information on the tracker's whereabouts, offering a handsome reward. One afternoon, Daniel returned from checking his trap lines, his body moving with a tense alertness Rosalind had not seen since their first days together. "We have visitors," he said, his voice low. He gestured toward the high ridge at the mouth of their valley. Rosalind looked but saw nothing. "Where?" "Two men. On horseback. They've been watching for an hour." He didn't seem surprised, only grimly resigned. Thorne's men. A cold fear, the same she'd felt in Redemption Gulch, returned. "What do they want? To see where I live. To see if you're still with me. To see if we are vulnerable." He slung his rifle from his shoulder. "They won't come down. Not today. But they'll be back." His prediction proved true. For the next week they were watched. The men never came close enough to be a direct threat, but their presence was a constant oppressive weight. They were a reminder that the world of men, with its greed and its cruelty, was never far away. The peace of the valley felt violated. Daniel grew more vigilant, his silence returning, but this time it was the focused silence of a predator. He spent hours watching the watchers, mapping their movements, learning their habits. The first direct assault was subtle. One morning, Daniel found the spring that fed their stream had been fouled upstream with the carcass of a dead coyote. It was a deliberate act of malice, designed to poison their water source and force them out. Without a word, Daniel spent the entire day clearing the spring and digging a new temporary channel to bypass the contamination. His methodical, tireless work was a quiet act of defiance. The next attempt was more brazen. A few nights later, they were awoken by the frantic whinnying of the horses. Daniel was out of bed and through the door in a single fluid motion, rifle in hand. Rosalind rushed to the window. In the moonlight, she saw two figures near the corral. One was attempting to cut the ropes to steal their only means of transport, while the other held a lit torch, its flame dancing menacingly near the dry wood of the cabin wall. A gunshot exploded in the night, shockingly loud in their quiet valley. It wasn't the deep boom of Daniel's rifle. It was a pistol shot from one of the men. Daniel, who had melted into the shadows near the canyon wall, had not fired. He was circling them. One of the men yelled, "Show yourself, Breed! Thorne wants the woman back!" Suddenly from the darkness behind them, Daniel's voice rang out cold and clear. "She is not his." The men spun around, firing blindly into the shadows. Rosalind's heart leaped into her throat, but Daniel was no longer there. A rope snaked out from the darkness, catching the torch-wielding man around the ankles and yanking him off his feet. The torch flew into the air and landed in the damp earth, sputtering out. The second man panicked, turned to run, but Daniel emerged from the darkness like an apparition, tackling him to the ground. The fight was short, brutal, and silent. There were no grunts or yells, only the sickening thud of fists and a final choked gasp. When it was over, 2 groaning men were tied up at the base of the canyon wall. Daniel stood over them, his chest heaving, his face a mask of cold fury in the moonlight. He had not killed them. He had simply and completely neutralized them. He came back to the cabin, his knuckles bruised and bloody. Rosalind met him at the door with a basin of water and clean cloths. As she tended to his hands, her touch gentle, their eyes met. "This will not end," she said softly. "He will keep sending them." Daniel nodded, his jaw tight. "I know." He looked at his bound captives, then back at her. "He does not want you. He wants to win. He wants to break what he cannot have." She saw the truth in his words. Thorn wasn't just trying to reclaim her. He was trying to destroy the peace they had built, to prove that a man like Daniel could not have something beautiful, that a woman like her could not find happiness with an outcast. He was trying to drag them back into the filth of his world. "Then we cannot stay here hiding," she said, her voice filled with a new, hard-won strength. "We cannot wait for his shadow to consume us. We have to go back. We have to face him." The idea was terrifying, to return to Redemption Gulch, to the source of their troubles. But as she looked at Daniel, she knew it was the only way. They could not spend their lives looking over their shoulders. To truly be free, they had to extinguish the shadow at its source. Daniel looked at her, searching her face. He saw not fear, but resolve. The woman he had rescued was now standing beside him as an equal ready to fight. A slow, grim smile touched his lips. "Tomorrow," he said, "we ride for redemption." They rode into Redemption Gulch, not at dawn, but in the full high noon glare of the sun. They came not as fugitives, but as arbiters of a delayed justice. Tailing behind Daniel's buckskin was one of Thorn's hired guns, slumped over his saddle, his hands tied. The other man was forced to walk, tethered by a rope, his face a canvas of bruises and humiliation. The town came to a standstill. Shopkeepers emerged from their doorways. Prospectors lowered their drinks. The blacksmith, holding a hammer, simply stared. This was not the silent, furtive tracker they knew. This was a man making a statement. Rosalind rode beside him, her head held high, her fear a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but her resolve a burning fire. They stopped in the middle of the street, directly in front of the Gilded Cage saloon. "Thorn." Daniel's voice boomed, a sound that carried from the mercantile to the livery. It was a voice no longer rusted with disuse, but honed by conviction. "Come out and claim your dogs." The batwing doors flew open. Bartholomew Thorn appeared, his face flushed with whiskey and surprise. His usual sneer was in place, but his eyes darted nervously to the 2 captive men, then to the determined faces of Daniel and Rosalind. 2 of his other thugs fanned out on the boardwalk beside him, their hands hovering near their pistols. "Well, well," Thorn blustered, trying to regain control. "The savage returns, and he's brought my property with him. I'm glad you saved me the trouble of hunting you down, Rosalind. Get over here now." "I am not your property, Mr. Thorn," Rosalind said, her voice clear and steady, devoid of the tremor she felt inside. "I never was. My father's debt was a lie." Daniel cut in, dismounting with a fluid grace. He stood in the street, a formidable figure of righteous anger. "I spoke with your men. They were quite forthcoming." He shoved the walking captive forward. "Tell him. Tell them all." The bruised man stumbled, looking from Daniel's cold stare to Thorn's murderous one. He licked his dry lips. He cooked the books," the man stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "The professor, he wasn't in debt. Thorn forged the markers. He was trying to trap him. To get to her. He nodded weakly toward Rosalind. A murmur went through the crowd. This was more than a private dispute. Thorn had cheated one of their own, a foolish but harmless man. Thorn's face turned from red to white. Lies the breed has tortured him into— No, a new voice said. From the crowd a man stepped forward. It was Dr. Evans, a quiet, bookish man who had attended to Rosalind's father on several occasions. Alistair Vance confided in me weeks ago. He said he couldn't understand the numbers. He suspected he was being cheated, but was too frightened of Thorn to say anything. Thorn's eyes widened in fury. His power was built on a foundation of fear and intimidation, and now that foundation was cracking. "This is my town," he roared, his composure finally shattering. He drew his pistol, a silver-plated Colt, and aimed it not at Daniel, but at Rosalind. "She is mine." But Daniel had anticipated it. He was a man who read movements, who understood the split-second telegraphs of violence. Before Thorn could pull the trigger, Daniel had his own rifle to his shoulder. But he didn't fire. Instead, he spoke his voice, ringing with a power no one in that town had ever heard from him. "Look around you, Thorn. For years you have bled this town. You have cheated, you have bullied, and you have threatened. You think these people are yours? They are just afraid of you. But fear is not loyalty." He glanced at the blacksmith. "How many times has he paid you less than your due for your work?" He looked at the owner of the general store. "How much credit have you been forced to extend to his men?" He was giving voice to their silent grievances, to the resentments that had festered for years under Thorn's thumb. "This woman," Daniel continued, his gaze locking with Thorn's, "showed me that a voice is a tool for truth, not just for threats. And the truth is, you are nothing but a thief and a bully, and your time in this town is over." It was the final push. The blacksmith, his face set like granite, took a heavy step forward, his hammer held like a weapon. The store owner disappeared into his shop and reappeared with a shotgun. Dr. Evans stood his ground, a symbol of quiet defiance. The crowd was no longer a collection of spectators. It was becoming a mob. Thorn saw his power evaporating in the noonday sun. His thugs, seeing the tide turn, began to back away toward the saloon doors. Thorn was alone. Panicked, his finger tightened on the trigger. A single shot rang out. It wasn't Daniel's. It was from the town's elderly and often drunk sheriff, who had finally found a moment of sober courage. The bullet tore through Thorn's gun hand. The silver Colt clattered into the dust. Thorn screamed, clutching his bloody wrist, his face a mask of shock and pain. It was over. The reign of Bartholomew Thorn had ended, not with a dramatic gunfight, but with a collective act of courage sparked by a man who had once been voiceless. Daniel lowered his rifle. He walked over to Thorn, who was whimpering on the ground, and looked down at him, not with hatred, but with a kind of finality. "You don't own people," he said, quietly. "You don't own this town, and you don't own her." He turned his back on the defeated man and walked to Rosalind, who had dismounted and was standing, trembling with reaction. He took her hands in his. They were steadying each other. In the middle of the dusty street, surrounded by the townsfolk who were finally finding their own voices, they stood together, two survivors who had walked back into the fire and emerged not just unscathed, but forged anew. The aftermath in Redemption Gulch was swift and decisive. With Thorn's authority shattered, the town's latent sense of justice, however rusty, took over. The sheriff, emboldened by his one heroic act, locked Thorn in his own jail cell to await the arrival of the circuit judge. His two captured men were run out of town with a stern warning, and his other thugs scattered like cockroaches in the light. Alistair Vance, sobered by the near-catastrophic consequences, of his weakness, packed his few remaining belongings, and with a final tearful apology to his daughter, took the next stagecoach east, seeking a quieter, less tempting life. Daniel and Rosalind could have left. They could have returned to the sanctuary of their hidden valley, to the quiet life they had built, and no one would have blamed them. The world of men had proven to be a dangerous, ugly place. But something had changed in them both. They stayed in town for a few days, at the request of Dr. Evans, lodging in the small rooms above his surgery. Daniel gave his testimony to the sheriff, his account clear, concise, and damning. But it was Rosalind who noticed the real shift. The townsfolk no longer looked at Daniel with suspicion and fear. They looked at him with a newfound respect. They called him Daniel Not Stone. The blacksmith offered to shoe his horses for free. The store owner's wife pressed a warm apple pie into Rosalind's hands, her eyes full of gratitude. They had not just defeated a villain. They had given the town its courage back. They had reminded the people of Redemption Gulch that they were a community, not just a collection of individuals cowed by one man's greed. On their last evening in town, they walked to the edge of the settlement as the sun set, painting the sky in the same brilliant colors they had seen on their first journey together. The air was cooler now, carrying the promise of autumn. "We could go back," Rosalind said softly, looking toward the distant canyons that held their cabin. "It would be peaceful." "Yes," Daniel agreed. He picked up a smooth, flat stone and skimmed it across a nearby watering hole. It skipped 4 times before sinking. "But peace is not the same as hiding." He turned to her, his slate eyes serious in the fading light. "For years I hid. From the world. From my own voice. I thought silence was safety. You taught me it was just a different kind of cage." He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. "You taught me grace, Rosalind. Not the Boston kind, with teacups and fancy words. The kind that matters. The grace to face the pain of the past and not let it destroy you. The grace to forgive." "And you," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "You taught me what courage looks like. Not the loud, boastful kind, but the quiet, enduring kind. The courage to stand for what is right, even when you are standing alone. The courage to hope for something better." They stood in a comfortable silence, no longer a void, but a shared understanding. The life they had in the canyon was beautiful, a haven for 2 wounded souls to heal. But healing was not the end of the journey. "I was thinking," Daniel set his gaze on the small, flickering lights of the town. "Dr. Evans is getting old. He could use help. And the children here, they have no teacher." Rosalind looked from the town back to his face, and she saw the future in his eyes. It was not a future of hiding, but of building. A future where he could be more than a tracker, and she could be more than a refugee. They could be part of something. They could help this flawed, struggling town become the place its name promised, a place of redemption. "A school?" she asked, a slow smile spreading across her face. "A home," he answered, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. "Here, with you." It was not a question, but a statement of fact, a foundation stone for a life they would build together. They would not abandon their cabin, it would be their sanctuary, their retreat. But they would no longer be defined by their isolation. They would have a foot in both worlds, in the wild grace of the canyons and in the messy, hopeful heart of a community, learning to be brave. He had paid for a bride with a bag of gold, a desperate act to save a woman he didn't know. But he had received so much more. He had received a teacher, a partner, a reason to speak. And she, in fleeing a life of servitude, had found a man who respected her strength and cherished her spirit. Together in the dusty heart of the West, they had found the one thing more valuable than gold, the courage to build a future side by side. So the silent man found his voice, and the captive woman found her freedom. But their story is more than just a tale of the Wild West. It's a reminder that our deepest wounds can sometimes lead to our greatest strengths, and that the right person can give us the courage not just to survive, but to truly live. Daniel and Rosalind's journey shows us that grace isn't about polite society. It's about seeing the humanity in someone when no one else will. And hope isn't a passive wish. It's an active choice, a decision to build something new from the wreckage of the past. If their story of finding a voice in the silence and a home in the wilderness moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a story of resilience and redemption. And most importantly, subscribe to the channel for more tales from history that feel like they were torn from the pages of real life. Thank you for listening.